In the training room? Yes? Can they hear me okay?
Is it good?
Can they hear me okay in there?
I think so. Yeah, let me just double check,
Okay.
okay?
Thanks, Nikki.
I guess they went to the.
Jeff,
There we go.
can you hear us?
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Too loud? No,
Down just a little bit, because of the.
Yes, yeah.
Perfect.
We'll be back with you. Jeff, do you want us to mute? I'd love to unmute it. Well, if you guys want to ask a question, I mean.
Yeah.
Okay. Only a couple people logged in so far. We might give it a couple minutes. All right. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I've got some broker things to share with you. I've got some new charts that I've been working with. Several of the agents had asked for more information. We're comparing year over year, February to February, March to March, April to April. But I've been asked to say, well, what's happening, in the past few months? So I'm gonna, maybe too big. Let's go. Can everybody see that okay? Just, yes?
Yeah.
Can you read it? I could probably go up a little more. Then you'll lose the, how about 110? There we go. All right. So what this chart attempts to do is to take multiple different pieces of information and put it all in one chart. And here we're looking at data through the end of March. The April information usually doesn't come out until the 10th or 11th because we give time for the month to end and for all the transactions to be posted. But if you take a look here, I'll go a little bigger so you can just see the graph, but there you go. You take a look, it's kind of interesting to see what's been happening. So if we go back to the beginning of 2021, you can see that the green bar is sold listings. The dark green is sold listings and the green bar is listings for sale. So you can see at the beginning of 21, we had 27, this is just Collier County now, residential properties. But you can see we had nearly 3,000 properties for sale and around 1,200 sales. So you can start to see these numbers go through in the green and dark green. So you notice that as we got into April, we actually had more sales than we had properties available for sale. So we completely flipped from January, where we had 1,262 sales and there was 2,700 for sale. But by the month of March, we had more sold than for sale. So we were starting really to eat into our inventory pretty rapidly in March, April, May, June, and we got into July, and those numbers started to level off a little bit simply because there was a lack of supply. So you now see then, as we got later into the year, starting October, November, a little bit in December, but most of, now take a look at January, February, and March, where we're not starting to see more properties available for sale than sold. This means that the inventory is becoming more balanced. So we should start to see a little bit more relief, I guess, in terms of supply. Remember, 2021 was one of the best years, if not the best year we've ever had in real estate in this market. So, and you can see why, because there was inventory available, but as you get into starting in May, June, July, all the way out there, you start to see we're selling a lot more than we have available, which means we're just cutting into inventory. So look at the red line, which is the pendings, okay? So those track the amount of pending and that went on. So the green is the solds, dark green, and the red line is pendings. And you notice that up into June of last year, and then again in December, you start to see that the pendings were exceeding the new listings, but then that started to change a little bit starting in the middle of the year, where we start to see the blue line, which is new listings, exceeding the pendings. What does that mean? When you see the new listings exceeding the pendings, you have a situation there where you're building inventory. And you can start to see that in the green bars underneath, where in January there was 1,022 for sale and we sold 918. So we keep talking about a shift. There is a little bit of a shift in the market, and that we're starting to build a little bit of inventory. You can see the green bars, January, February, and now into March. You can see that there's more inventory available. And in April, you had 1,784 new listings and only 1,462 went pending. So this is a sign, and we'll try to add this data with the regular charts we do every month, because it's giving you the movement in the market. And what we see there is some pretty good movement in that, seeing some good movement in that the new listings are exceeding the pendings. We know that there have been more price decreases than increases in the market lately. And so we're starting to see the market trend to be a little more healthy. Is it a buyer's market? We're ways away from that, but we're trending a little bit more toward a balanced market. All right, so let's take a look then at another graph that I did that I think you might like. And that's Lee County. Make sure we got Collier County. There we go. Nip that one and share this one. So share screen, Collier month supply. Can everybody see that okay? Can you raise your hand if you can see that okay? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So this is another thing that we're looking at here, and we're starting to see the months of inventory that's been available at the end of each month. And then in the blue line, we're seeing the we're seeing the median price. Now, there's probably been a little more fluctuation in median price than we've normally seen because there's less sales. So the increase in median price has still been consistently there, really from January of 21. It dipped a little bit in August, and then it started coming right back up. And take a look at what happened. See, back in January of this is Collier now, residential properties only. You start to see we went from 2.2 months supply all the way down to 0.7 in June of 21. We started building inventory then from there, and the median price increases were a little bit more modest. So we're still very much in a seller's market, but you can see the overall trend line is a little bit better. Not 50% better, but enough better that we're starting to see some more inventory, some more choices, and we're starting to see the rate of increase in the median price drop a little bit. So let's take a look real quick at Lee County. Let's see. Here. Get big there. And go to 125. Okay. All right. So Lee County, you can see across the board, there's more inventory in Lee County than in Collier County, but you can start to see the same pattern. Okay. We started in January 21 with a lot of listings. And we went in starting in March, April, May, June, July, we were selling more than we had available for sale. So you can see the pending line started to droop a little bit because we just didn't have as many properties for sale. But take a look at new listings in Lee County. You can start to see that beginning in December, where we had a month where we had more sales than we had active. Numbers are a little run together here, but you can see we had 2191 sales and only 1709 for sale. We were still using inventory, but now you start to see a fairly positive trend. Now the new listings are exceeding the pendings. Pendings being those closings that are going to come in the next 30, 60, 90 days. You're starting to see the new listings that are coming on the market are starting to exceed the pending. So we're actually taking a look at a little bit of an uptick in terms of the number of sales because we have more inventory to sell. All right, so let's take a look at the other chart for Lee. We have a question here in the chat. Price chart. Okay. Let's see if we can go here. Oops. I'm going to share that. Oh, there we go. Okay, so there again, Lee County a little bit different in that the median price is much lower, and you notice the rate of increase is slowing quite a bit, but it is still on an upward trend. But look at what's happening to month's supply of inventory. Okay, we started with a lot, we went down to 0.6%, but we're still, don't have a lot of months of inventory supply based on the rate at which we're selling. So we still have median prices increasing, but we're building a little bit of inventory, and we're starting to see the market stabilize a little bit, albeit still very much a seller's market. All right, I got another slide I'd like to show you. Let's see if we can go to matrix. All right, I'm gonna share this. Okay, so if everybody can see this, you know there's a I don't know what that message means, so. You see this little window in the center here? I don't know whether I can make it bigger. Control plus, 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 plus. All right, can everybody see that little Market Watch window in the center of the screen? Yes?
Yes.
Where my cursor is?
Yes.
Okay, so this is something you might want to watch in your own way every day. This is 7 days and it's all of a Collier and Lee, the entire MLS. You can customize it by hitting here, and you can hone into a neighborhood. You can hone into just Collier. You can hone into a particular area that you like to look at, group of geocodes. But take a look what's happening here. This is the last 7 days. You can vary this to the last day, and you can add different kinds of property, and you can go in here and customize your search to narrow it down. So take a look at new listings, 890, and look at pendings, 1118. So we're narrowing the gap between what's coming on the market and what's going on pending, and very definitely a good sign that we're building some inventory there. We sold, the other thing to look at is the sold to pendings. So we're selling about what we're pending. And that means that the disparity in the market where we were pending and selling a lot more than we had coming in was creating upward pressure on prices. So these are, you can actually zero in on these individual columns by clicking on them. But one of the things that I think is really interesting for you to look at, we had 500 price decreases, and that's maybe, and we had 1,100 sold. So really half of the properties sold are experiencing price decreases. This is an indication that buyers are, not willing to pay some of the prices that these listings are being offered at. So I can click on this back on market, for example, and I could get a report. And one of the things that I think is interesting is if I look at the single line and I sort this by days on market, I go up here like this. If I sort this column by days on market, take a look at the fact that we have to go to page 5 or even page 6 to get to 20 days. So at the end of page 5, we're right at 20 days. And that's 101 out of the, 125 out of the top 212. We're back on the market in less than 20 days. So if you're looking for a customer in a particular area, again, you can sort this column by development name or subcondo within a development, and you can zero in on an area that maybe your customer's looking for, and you can start to see, here's a property in Beach Walk Isles. It was only on the market 2 days before it came back. So this is still an indication that there's a lot of instability in the contracts. What does that mean? That means properties are coming back on the market faster than normal, really. I mean, they're going off the market probably on as-is contracts. People are sometimes still putting multiple as-is contracts in, but people are going through their due diligence. Sellers are allowing a little bit less due diligence than they have in the past. So you got shorter inspection periods, and you got people that are going back out on the market very quickly. So if your buyer is a little frustrated because you can't find them inventory, and you were able to zero in on this particular statistic, every day for a market, I think it might be helpful to you. So that's a stat that is available to you in the middle of your MLS. Maybe I'm not going to get back there. From your dashboard, you always have in the center that market watch. And you can kind of monitor the market. And again, you can go in and customize it to a particular area. If you just want all Naples areas, you can click that and hit save. And you go back, and now your chart is just showing Naples areas, where we had 315 new listings in the last 7 days, and we had 350 pended, 386 sold. So again, the market is starting to balance quite a bit. Look at the number of price decreases compared to the number that are sold. Nearly half of the properties that are being sold and pended have had price decreases. So you can use this, I think, as a handy thing when you start off your day. It's right on your dashboard. You can kind of take a look at what's going on in the market. Notice we had 60 back on markets in Naples and 202 in the overall market. So depending upon the market you're in, you might find that different markets behave differently. Here we go to page 2, we go into about number 27 of 60s is 20 days. So a little bit less volatility in the Naples market, but still quite a few properties going off the market and coming back on fairly quickly. So again, you can sort this by the development. If your customer's looking in a particular area, now you can start to see every day listings that might be coming back on the market in a particular area. All right. Okay, check the chat here. I don't see anything in the chat. Is there any questions on that? Are those charts helpful to you? I'll publish those bar and line graphs when we get the April results here. Excuse me, which we should get probably in the next 2 or 3 days. And I'll be updating the market graphics that you can send out to your customers. So it's an interesting thing to be able to not only see what's happening year over year, but what the trend lines are on a monthly basis, which those new graphs will give you a little bit more information there. All right. So we're on to the contract part of the class, and I'm going to, let's see here. Here, control. Okay, so I want to share with you, we talked in the talked at the end of the FAR contract. We talked about all of the different riders that were available to you. I'll close that for a minute. Go to the residential contract here. Open sesame. Okay, slight technical difficulties here. Florida. Download. All right. So we're going right to the end of the Fha Va contract, which is kind of where we left off last week. And I want to talk a little bit about the riders or addendums that they provide. And I'm almost there. There we go. Okay. Come back here. Okay, can everybody see that okay? So these are the riders that we remember that if you were with us last week, we kind of got through the entire Fha Va contract, and the riders at the end are plentiful. I want to go through 2 or 3 of these in some detail, because I think that you want to fully understand the condo and homeowner rider. So I'm going to bring those up here and let's see what we got here. I want to do a little housekeeping here. Hang on. Oh, no. A, B. All right. Let's do this one first. Okay, let me go to about 25. All right, so can everybody see that okay? This is the condominium rider to the Fha Va contract. And it differs greatly from the Nabor because there isn't a condominium rider or addendum in the Nabor contract. Fha Va provides for one. And the first thing I have to say is thou shalt not use this rider with a Nabor contract. A lot of people say, well, I can't find one in the Nabor library, so I'll use this one. The problem that you have when you mix contracts is you mix terminology. Obviously, any reference to line numbers or terms in the contract are not the same. So if this was ever to get into any kind of litigation, the first thing the friendly attorney would say is these documents don't match. They don't mean anything to each other. And the terminology is different. So therefore, the contract could be deemed in trouble. So, but the rider for the condominium in the Fha Va contract is really something that we get asked for every year when we do the revisions to the Nabor contract. And so far, the general sentiment has been the system that we use for Nabor, which is to provide the 7 key documents, give the buyer 3 days to review them and make any objections and cancel if they want to within that 3 business day rescission period. But Fha Va for some time has had this handy dandy condominium rider. And you know, it certainly you can make an argument that there's some good stuff in here. The first page really basically goes through the basic rights in the condominium, whether or not it's required and how many days that you must have to initiate your application to the condo association. And so it's rare, but you'll need to check with the condominium association if they do have a right of first refusal. And what's that? That means that if the condominium association has a right of first refusal and you put your property on the market, a member of the association may have the right to buy that if it's a price that's agreed upon ahead of it being available for sale to the general public. There are not many of these left, but there are still some, so you want to make sure that there is no right of first refusal where you list the property, and all of a sudden somebody comes up and says, wait a minute, the condo association has first shot at this. Again, not very often, but be aware that it's there. The members of the A is the association itself being able to buy it. B is the members of the association, whether they have a right to exercise the purchase option before somebody that's not a member of the association has that right. Okay. The next thing in here you'll see is the ability to put fees in here. The big hangup I think we have with Nabor contract is people, well, where do I put the monthly fees? Where do I put the minimums? Where do I put, other charges that might apply to this particular condo association? They could have a capital contribution. They could have, any type of a one-time charge. They could have annual fees. If you get into a bundled golf community, that is, that the condominium inside there could have different rents and different fees. So these are the current association assessments and installments can be listed here. So annual assessments levied by the association and rent on recreational areas shall be made current by seller at closing, and buyer shall reimburse seller for prepayments. So you notice that this is the different kind of assessment that we talked about in the main body of the contract, where the assessments referred to in the main body of the contract were strictly public assessments, sewer, water, road improvements that are assessed by homeowners, by the doors in the homeowners association. Move this around. There we go. All right, so here's a place to list any assessments that may be on the books at the time that the property is being transferred. Okay. Property is part of a homeowners association. We'll go to rider B. All right. Special assessments. We're talking about a checkbox here. If they're levied or they exist as of the effective date and are disclosed above by the seller in that area above there, then you have the right to select whether the buyer or the seller shall pay the installments. And if the box is checked, the seller, now remember, I'm not a big fan of blanks, but if you leave blank, buyer shall pay assessments due after closing. If seller is checked, seller shall pay all assessments in full prior to the time of closing. So many people check buyer, seller pays everything up to closing, buyer pays afterwards. Special assessments levied or pending exist to the effective date and have not been disclosed above, then the seller has to pay them in full at the time of closing. So if there was an assessment on the books that the seller did not disclose to the buyer in the seller's disclosure or otherwise, then they become the responsibility of the seller to pay in full prior to closing, similar to the Nabor contract. If after the effective date, an association imposes special assessments for improvements, which was not pending as the effective date, then seller shall pay all amounts due before closing and buyer shall pay amounts due after closing. That's somewhat different than the Nabor contract, which says that if they don't exist as of the effective date, then they're the buyer's responsibility. A special assessment shall be deemed levied for purposes of this paragraph on the date when the special assessment has been approved as required for enforcement. So the date of which a special assessment is determined to be prior to or after the effective date is based on the date that is voted in by a meeting of the association. All right. There's a place for the seller to disclose any type of litigation here. And then we don't really get, there used to be quite a bit of angst around the sprinkler system retrofit, in which the state was forcing buildings over 4 stories to have sprinkler systems or life-saving equipment. And then they kind of modified the rule that allows the association to forego the retrofitting. Some of these buildings were facing millions of dollars to try to get retrofitted. And as a result, the state did allow to say that if the association believes that the cost is greater than the benefit, they can, as an association, forego the retrofitting requirements. Again, you don't see it too much anymore. Most of the major people that couldn't afford to do any retrofitting have already waived that obligation. So now we get down into the disclosure, and the you have two check boxes. Box A is the buyer acknowledges that they've been provided a copy of all the condo docs, and they've been provided prior to the execution of this contract. So if you're submitting an offer and your buyer wants to make it as strong as possible and has had the opportunity to look at the documents in advance. Now, you know, the market moves pretty fast here. So oftentimes the buyer doesn't have the luxury of taking a few days to review the condo docs prior to making their offer. But if they did, and they were able to review the docs, especially if you have a buyer that's looking in an area or in a condominium complex, and maybe they haven't been able to be successful in 1 or 2 bids. Now they have the docs, they've looked at them, and they can go to the seller and say, hey, I've already reviewed my docs and I'm already ready to go. I don't need the 3-day right of rescission. That can make your offer stronger than another one where they're going to ask for their requirement in box B, where they say the agreement's voidable by the buyer if they get a 3-day review period, business days. Remember, in this particular case, the deadline does not include Saturdays, Sundays, and legal holidays. So you can, and you know, delivery is day 0. So you could theoretically deliver documents on a Friday, and the buyer would have until Wednesday to do their 3-day right of review, thereby giving them some extra time. All righty then. So the buyer either has the documents, is waiving their right, or they're requesting the 3-day right of review. And this is the buyer's request for documents. Buyer's entitled to at seller's expense current copies of all the documents. Again, you know, it's really nice when you run across a listing where the listing agent has taken the time to upload all these documents so that the buyer doesn't have to worry about getting them. But in many cases, you as the buyer's agent are going to need to reach out and get these docs. You can get some of them from the clerk of courts documents. That's the bylaws, articles of incorporation, and the documents that are put out to create the condo documents. So those you can get from public record. Also, you want to call the association property manager. They will have the most current versions of the budget, and definitely the financial statement, application to the condo association, rules and regs, Q&A. Those you can get directly in current form from the condo association if you're not provided them by the listing agent. Paragraph 7 allows the buyer to say, hey, I've received all the documents. That's rarely do you see that because it's usually part of the offer, but the buyer could say they've received the documents. So number 8 is basically saying that the seller has a right and interest to use the following parking spaces, garage areas, or it could be a dock, could be a storage unit that often provided down in the basement of many condominiums. They walled off an area for each unit to store bicycles and other things that they don't want to store in their condo. So those, if there's a storage locker or a cabana or a boat dock, that's where you put it in there. So this is an interesting paragraph here. The rights and obligations arising under paragraph 11 and 12 to maintain, replace, or treat are limited to the seller's individual condominium units, and unless the seller is otherwise responsible, do not extend to the common elements, limit comment. This was a issue during Irma where areas outside of the seller's individual condominium unit incurred damage, and the limit to the seller's liability is just their unit. It's not areas that were otherwise responsible by the association. And we like this language because, there was oftentimes claims after Irma that the seller should be responsible for limited common elements around the building. It could be the entryways, it could be the parking garage, it could be the areas that are outside of the seller's condominium, but buyers felt the sellers were responsible for that. So this little governance form has been updated, I think, in the last couple of years, and it's one of the key forms that is part of the 7 documents. And if you supply everything but this, the buyer can argue that they never got all the documents. So make sure you get this. It's in the library, our contract library. Make sure you include it as part of the docs that the customer has to sign. All right, let me look here and see. Are there any questions in the chat? No? All right, well, let's take a look also at the HOA rider, and then we can talk about some of the others there. What I've got here. There we go. So I can share. Hey, Mark, good afternoon. Well, thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here.
Hey, it worked. All right, so this is the counterpart to the condominium document, and it is really for HOAs. Now, in many communities, it's not unusual that you have a condo association inside a master HOA. So if it's a Twin Eagles where there's several condominium associations in there, but there's a master association that takes care of the golf courses and the community amenities and that sort of thing. So you'll have both documents required for one sales contract. You could have more than one HOA inside there that the owner is responsible for. Typically, these payments for the HOA from a condo or from a smaller HOA inside a master HOA, those typically are paid by the association and collected at once, so that the homeowner's not having to pay twice. Where can you find the governance documents? They are in the condominium governance document is in the contract library. I believe it's also in the contract library on nabor.com, and it's very easy to Google it and get it off and get the PDF off the internet. But make sure you get the most current version. So this part of the HOA disclosure is identical to the Nabor version, because this is the wording directly out of statute 720.401, which is homeowner associations. So the homeowners association disclosure, if provided timely with the contract, is considered notification of the buyer, and the buyer, it does not necessarily have the right to getting all of the documents and having a 3-day right of rescission. Where you get into the situation is if it's not provided to the purchaser before executing this contract, you'll see in the beginning paragraph. So if you're a listing agent, you want to make sure that this is provided timely, uploaded with your listing, and that it is submitted with the buyer's contract. Therefore, that eliminates the buyer's right to have a 3-day right of rescission. However, if you don't provide it and you submit your offer and it's accepted and a couple of days go by and the HOA disclosure has not been provided by the buyer's agent to the listing agent, or vice versa, there is a 3-day right of review that does trigger for the buyer. So you always want to be careful with that. If you're the buyer's agent and the listing agent doesn't bother to provide that to you, you got two options. You can provide it signed by your buyer, or you can have a get out of jail free card for your buyer. Because if the listing agent does not provide it and it isn't signed timely with the contract, it does give the homeowner, the buyer, a chance to trigger a 3-day right of review. And yes, they could trigger it on the day of closing. So there you go. The name of the community is important. I have had a case where the name of the community was the old name of the community. Many of these developments are built in phases, so they'll have a different HOA for each phase, and then they'll come along after a few years and take all of the phases and combine them into one HOA under one name. But if you don't have that name correctly spelled, or if you've used the name of, Eagle Creek Section 4, and that now has been folded into the Eagle Creek HOA, then you could run the risk of not having an accurate HOA disclosure. And that again triggers the buyer to do a 3-day right of review and to get out of the contract. So I had one that was that was the old spelling of the HOA, and the buyer got buyer's remorse and walked away. So I'll be careful with that. Same with the amounts in 3 and in 6. Those amounts have to be accurate. And in general, budgets come out for these associations in the 4th quarter, and they're adopted by January 1st. So, you'll see a lot of variation sometimes in the listings in a community based on the last time this document was updated. So make sure you keep it up to date. Make sure if it's going to change, that you put the current version out there with your listing and insist that it be signed by the buyer. This is a real protection for your seller against really a bad situation for them. If it's not provided and it's not accurate, then the buyer has a chance to walk away. All right. So again, these assessments and quarterly fees are very similar to the HOA disclosure for Nabor, because this is the actual law there, and it's going to be signed by the buyer. Now, Fha Va is added at page 2 to their HOA disclosure for people to be able to put in all kinds of fees that may be associated with the HOA that are not part of the disclosure up above here. So there could be a golf fee, there could be a dining room minimum, there could be any kind of additional assessments above and beyond what was in the base assessment up above. There is a checkbox in B that says the buyer will pay installments after the closing date. And again, similar to the condominium, if the seller's checked, sellers should pay all assessments in full. And you have to be a little bit careful with this because many of, especially the bundle golf communities, have a lot of different assessments, but they may put in a new workout center, and there'll be an assessment of all the members of that over 36 months at X dollars a month. They may renovate the clubhouse, same thing. They may renovate one of the golf courses, same thing. So you could have half a dozen special assessments that are small monthly amounts that are payable over a period of time. And if your seller is expecting these to be passed on to the buyer, you gotta make sure that box is checked and you make sure that's negotiated to make sure that everybody's on the same page. I have had cases where the seller found out when they got their settlement statement that they had to pay all these assessments going forward because they didn't understand the nature of the negotiations there, and the seller box was checked. The last part of this is for you to be able to provide the contact people for the association, so that if this is a form that's disclosed to you as a buyer, you now can call the association and find out any specific questions that you might have about the association. All right, checking the chat here. We don't have any other questions. So let's take a look at the remainder of the at the remainder of these riders and talk a little bit about them. What have we got here? Okay. All right, so if I look at it, go back to our list here. Okay, everybody can hopefully see that okay. Give me a thumbs up if you can. Okay, thank you. So there are a lot of other riders here, and I'm going to go through them a little bit. And if you'd like to see any of them, we can certainly bring them up, or I'll bring them up as we go along here to try to give you an idea. Many of these other riders are of low use, and they are not that important that you have them on the tip of your tongue. There is a little bit of seller financing going on in the market. It's very limited by the recent legislation in Congress that limited a seller to be able to do a limited amount of financing up to a certain number of homes if you're a builder, and allow an individual seller to sell their home using seller financing. Now, we may see an increase in seller financing with the increase in interest rates, because now a seller may be competitive, and if they don't need the immediate cash, they may be able to offer a 5 or 6% seller financing option to the buyer, which means the buyer would not have to go through the mortgage system. But typically, seller financing is you have a seller that's not looking for the cash, they're looking for the income. A lot of people maybe are moving into a retirement home and they would rather have the income than have a lump sum in cash. So they might take a substantial down payment and then take a monthly payment. Typically, seller financing balloons in 3 to 5 years, and it's typically effective, especially for buyers that can't get a favorable rate from the bank, either because of credit or because they've gone through a recent financial problem with their finances. So they're not able to get mortgage financing, and sometimes the sellers are willing to offer it. And as we see mortgage rates come up, there may be more of that. Understand that whenever there's seller financing, really recommend you get an attorney involved, because there has to be a note and mortgage written, and all the terms and everything are the same. There is a provision in this particular seller financing addendum for some terms to be placed in between the buyer and the seller. But I honestly recommend, if you're going to go there, that you have an attorney involved to make sure everything is drawn up properly, and that the seller's note is properly recorded in case they have to foreclose. Mortgage assumption. There are some VA loans that are assumable, but for the most part, mortgages are not assumable. The FHA VA, we can take a look at here real quick. The FHA VA addendum is important, rider, excuse me, because the seller is having to sign into the process and be willing to either contribute or at least make sure that they'll sign documents that the bank will require for FHA and VA mortgages. Let me just see here. All right. Yeah. Okay. It says participants can now see your application. So that's good. We'll go to 125. Okay, so anytime your buyer is going to use FHA or VA financing, you need to check the appropriate box in the financing contingency section of the contract. And technically, if you don't, and you try to go FHA on it and you check conventional, or you haven't checked the box for FHA, the seller could make the case that you are defaulting because you're asked for one type of financing and you're trying to go for another. So be careful of that. If you're going to use FHA or VA financing, you need to supply this rider. Okay. In most of the Fha Va riders, there's seller's initials and buyer's initials at the top are what seal the deal. There's usually not signatures on these. There are on some. I think there are on this one because of the nature of the. Yeah. Okay. In this particular case, we'd want to initial the top of the page, but also take a look at the bottom. Now, the first section is for FHA, and there is an appraisal limitation in there. It does say seller shall comply with all FHA VA regulations regarding lender and inspections and appraisal repairs. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever worked with VA loans, but the VA appraisal is quite a bit different than regular appraisal. So I know recently from personal experience, we refinanced our home using my wife's VA eligibility. And when the VA inspector came through, he noticed a few things in the home that he didn't feel, were right. I think we had a screen door lock that wasn't working right and a couple of other things. And they can actually say, as a condition of this appraisal, you need to make the following repairs, and they could cost some money. So that's where that box is there. So the seller could have to do some things to repair some things noticed by the VA appraiser in order to get the loan through. So there you go. If it's FHA financing, we check box 3. Again, and purchasers shall pay all loan expenses except and the shall be paid by if charged by the buyer's lender. One of the things, another thing I think in the VA financing is the seller is required to pay for the termite inspection. Don't ask me why, but that's just the way it's set up there. So here you have an appraisal contingency, but you also have a specific box to check for FHA financing. There is the requirement in here that the seller does sign a certification with the lender. So if you're going to do FHA or VA financing, make sure you let the seller know, because all of a sudden they get documents that they are forced to sign in order to make the loan work, and they were never expecting that in the first place. Here's the VA financing there. Again, seller shall pay all required fees under VA regulations up to purchaser shall prepay or shall pay all prepayments and escrows for taxes. So again, appraisal repairs, all right. If they're there and they exceed this amount here in paragraph 2, then seller elects to pay less than the full amount. Purchaser may elect to pay the balance or cancel the contract. So let's say in the unusual case that the VA inspector looks and says, this roof is in terrible condition. We need the seller to repair, at least repair the roof prior to funding of the loan. And the seller can say, I'm not putting a new roof on, and the buyer can say, okay, I'm going to cancel. That's a buyer's right to cancel in this particular case. So notice that the buyer and seller and sales associates for either side must sign this form to comply with federal law. So make sure when you fill this out, you're making an offer, you sign it and have the listing agent sign it. Otherwise, it's not a binding document. All right. I'll stop our share. Go back to there's the contract. Okay. Let's share that. This is maximum share day. Okay, so we've looked at the FHA, VA. The appraisal contingency basically is in addition to the appraisal that is now required in the financing part of it. So if your buyer is financing, chances are you don't need this document. However, if your buyer's paying cash and says, you know, I just want to make sure that I'm not paying $1.3 million for a home that's worth $1.1 million. So I want a appraisal contingency that says that it has to appraise for $1.3 million, or the buyer and seller can negotiate a reduction in price, or the buyer can walk away. I don't want to talk too much about short sale. There aren't very many of them anymore. Mark and I can remember back in the days of 2008, 9, 10, 11, and 12 that we did more short sales than we did regular sales. But I think those days are gone. Much of that was based on speculative lending. And in a short sale, the buyer and seller agree to a contract, and the lender becomes a third party that must approve the reduction in the the seller's amount that's going to be paid at closing. In other words, the lender has to agree to take a hit, a certain reduction in what balance owed in order to make the deal work. And there's language in there that says if it takes over a certain period of time that the buyer is able to cancel. Or if the seller gets terms back from the lender, like, okay, we'll reduce our mortgage to, by 15 or 50,000, but we want you to sign a note, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, to pay some of that back. And if that comes back and it's not acceptable to the seller also has a chance to walk away. Homeowners flood insurance, we may start to see a little bit more of that. Basically, the paragraph says that if the homeowners or flood insurance cost is over a certain amount, thereby probably putting the buyer's ability to qualify at risk, that the buyer can cancel. Mold inspection is a new addendum added this year to the most recent contract revisions. Basically, it says, hey, if there's mold found and the cost to remediate it exceeds a certain amount, then the buyer can walk away, or the seller can agree to pay the expense. So this is the first foray into mold that the FAR contract has taken in a number of years. And it's much different than the Nabor version, which basically eliminates mold counts that are non-allergenic and non-toxic. Obviously, there's mold everywhere in Florida. So where I see a limitation in this rider is that it just, the buyer puts a limit in there of $5,000 or $2,000 or whatever, and mold remediation gets expensive, and so they can say, look, we're not going to go forward with this because the cost to remediate this situation is greater than I'm willing to pay. The problem that I see is that many cases, the mold remediation is fairly simple, and it involves non-allergenic and non-toxic molds. So it's a little bit more risk to the seller. Jay, I don't know anybody that if it requires the buyer to ask that their deposit be held in an interest-bearing account and that they get the interest on the deposit. Don't see that too much anymore. Used to see it a little bit in builders contracts, but again, the as-is rider in K is basically turns the regular contract into an as-is contract, and the FAR as-is contract is identical to the FAR contract with the exception of the inspection provisions. Right to inspect, right to cancel is one of my favorite because it works very similarly to an as-is contract, only, let's see, maybe we could take a look at that one real quick. Stop share. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, so this is I guess if you take enough of my classes, you'll realize that Broker Jeff is not a fan at all of as-is contracts, but this does allow the buyer to get a due diligence period. But if the buyer does not walk away at the end of the due diligence period, then the contract proceeds as a normal inspection process, which is very well defined in the contract, and which we went over in great length with the 3 buckets, the general repairs, the wood destroying organisms, and the permits. So it's a much more orderly process for the buyer once they've done their due diligence. It may just be a few days to ask the seller to repair only defective items, and also the seller's maintenance obligation is enforced there. So I like this addendum. The problem with it is, or excuse me, this rider, problem with it is most agents don't understand it, and they don't see it as an alternative to the as-is contract. Okay, back to share. Okay, defective drywall. There's very little need for that addendum anymore. We had a problem in 2004 to 2006 where certain drywall that was manufactured, I believe it was in China, it was a German contractor that had a bunch of this stuff made and brought it into the US. It had high sulfur levels, and as a result, was hit by the moisture in the air in Florida, and it turned it into a toxic sulfuric acid mixture, very corrosive to electrical, to air conditioners, and it was a very bad period of time when people were bringing drywall in because we couldn't make enough of it locally or in the country. There were several communities in Naples, and many new homes out in the estates were built with defective drywall. And for the most part, once it was discovered, the contractors went into the new developments and removed all the drywall. Many cases had to replace the wiring and the air conditioning coils. But being that we are now 15 or 16 years downrange from that, if there was still defective drywall, I would think you would know about it. You would have had damage to your electrical circuits. Was also never proven to be a health hazard, but I can tell you from having been in a few of them, it was nasty. But I see some brokerages requiring that they still sign this, but I don't see, I saw one inspection report last year where the inspector concluded it was defective drywall, and we went in and analyzed it, and there was a little bit of corrosion on a couple of the circuits where there was wiring, but there was no deterioration. The air conditioner was fine, so really wasn't a true defective drywall situation. Coastal construction control line is a line that runs up the coastline for properties that are located very close to the water and are subject to much higher insurance rates and damage from wind and coastal flooding. There is a map of that on that you can get online, and there might even be an overlay in Matrix where you can determine if the home is inside that line. If so, you probably want this rider to inform for the buyer and seller to agree to certain conditions. Insulation disclosure is where it's a new construction. The buyer can request the insulation to be of a certain grade. I don't think, I teach this class a lot with several different attorneys. I don't think any of us have seen it ever used, so very little known use. Lead-based paint, again, another one that is a federal requirement. And if you have a home that's built before 1978, it's important that you include this. It's a federal law that you provide information for your buyer, and that you disclose that the seller knows of no lead-based paint conditions. I don't think we had a huge problem with lead-based paint in this market, but it's an age requirement that if the home is built prior to 78, that the seller disclose this information, that the buyer acknowledge it, and notice that all parties must sign this. Okay, there is a booklet that's in the contract library talking about the hazards of lead-based paint that you can also distribute to your buyer. It's called Protect Your Family from Lead in the Home. And again, very little issue with lead-based paint here, but the federal requirement is if the home is built before 78, that you provide this declaration from the seller and the buyer's acknowledgement, and also the licensee's acknowledgement and signature on there. I'm told that if they come in to audit you for your lead-based paint disclosures, and these are not completely filled out, that it's a $12,000 fine. I know that they had a number of these issues up in the Atlanta area a few years ago. I've not heard of anything, in this market. But if your home is built before 78, strongly suggest that you provide it to the buyer's agent from the listing agent. And if not, that the buyer's agent provides it. Housing for older persons is basically if there's a 55 and older community, it should be registered with the federal government as a 55 plus community. It's an occupancy, not an ownership restriction. Just states that at least one person in the home must be over 55. There's some limitations on visitation of people under 55, up to 14 days. So if it's in a 55 plus community, generally you'd like to have this document signed. Rezoning, there's another one that we very rarely see any of. If you're buying a property on the basis that you have to have it rezoned in order to use it, then you'd have the seller agree that if you couldn't have it rezoned, you could walk away. Lease purchase, lease option. Again, we don't see too many of these. If you have a situation where your buyer wants to lease the lease the premises with the option to buy, again, I think that's a good case to get an attorney to draw up the documents. There is some language in this lease purchase, lease option rider, but again, I think it needs to be drawn up as to exactly what. Usually there's a down payment involved by the buyer, and so much of the monthly rent gets credited toward the purchase, which is established at the time that you go to contract. But you know, a lot of sellers don't like it because you're having to establish a strike price at the time of contract where the buyer can buy, what the buyer can buy the property for. Pre-closing occupancy, the answer is never. Seriously, pre-closing occupancy allows a buyer to occupy the property prior to closing. And there are very few cases where this kind of thing is even necessary to consider. It's not a lease, and there's a great deal of liability associated with having a buyer occupy the property prior to it being theirs. So try to avoid that at all costs. If you do, it's there for that purpose. Post-closing occupancy we see a lot of lately because sellers want to stay in the home to find something else or to move out. So we can take a look at that one real quick here. Sorry. There we go. Sorry. Okay, so this one is one that we're seeing a lot more use of because sellers want to stay for a few days. Again, this isn't meant for a long-term situation, not meant for 8-10 months. If it's 6 weeks, couple months, this is where it's in. This contract basically requires that within so many days prior to closing that they deliver to each other a mutually accepted written lease post-occupancy agreement. So this used to require a lease to be drawn up. When they changed the language a little bit to allow a post-closing occupancy agreement to be done in lieu of a lease where you have landlord, tenant, and all kinds of things. So the Nabor post-closing occupancy agreement is often cited as one that is pretty detailed and pretty fair to all parties. So you could use that or one that could be drawn up by an attorney. So basically, you're drawing up the terms if there's any monthly rent, if there's any deposit, and basically it's the interesting thing, the way this is written, is that the seller's maintenance obligation shall continue after closing until possession. However, seller's repair, replacement, and treatment obligations under paragraph 12. So yes, if something is not working when you do your walkthrough at the end of the seller's occupation, yes, the seller has a requirement to address those issues, but no, you can't escrow money to do it. The paragraph 12 allows the buyer to escrow money, seller's money, and there's a little catch-all at the end here. If parties fail to deliver, then either party can cancel. So, but you see a lot more of this. Generally recommend a post-closing occupancy agreement, not a lease. And as I say, there's generally some of them out there, including the Nabor contract, post-closing occupancy agreement that could possibly be used here. All right, we're nearing the end, and I'm going to be through here pretty soon. Let's see what we got here. Back here. Screen. Okay. Sale of buyer's property, fairly straightforward. It says that I'm the buyer and I have a property there's a checkbox in there, say it's under contract or for sale, and that my ability to close on this contract is based on the sale of that home. And you notice when we went through our financing flow chart there, that's the last thing that can happen after everything's arranged, is that the buyer cannot sell their property, or the contract that they had fell through. Therefore, it gives the buyer the right to cancel. You see quite a few of these now because properties are selling so quickly, and sellers are willing to take the risk to get a top dollar contract to allow the buyer to complete the sale of their home. Backup contracts, another one that's really a good idea. If your buyer loses out on a bid, then they may want to say, look, I know you didn't take our contract, but can we enter into a backup contract? And the backup contract is very similar to the regular contract, but it has the rider that the buyer can sign, saying, hey, I want to be in backup here. And that gives the seller the option of saying, okay, I got a really good contract. Am I going to, if there's a deadline date or one that the seller is not reaching, then see if I got the right one here. Let me take it back right. There we go. See if I can get that one up there. All right, hold on. I'll close some windows here, I guess. All right, that should do it. Where is my backup contract? There it is. Okay. All right, so we're on the backup contract. We're almost done here. So again, this is the ability, this goes along with accompanies the regular contract with this rider, and basically says it's subject to the termination of a prior executed contract between a seller and a third party. If the contract is terminated and seller delivers written notice to termination to buyer on or before, this contract shall be removed and this backup contract shall move into first position. The effective date of this backup contract shall be the date delivers written notice of termination of the prior contract. Buyer may terminate this backup contract. So basically, it says that as soon as the seller delivers written notice to the original buyer, this contract becomes primary, and that the effective date is the date that the seller delivers written notice of termination to the prior executed contract. The buyer can terminate the contract by delivering written notice to seller prior to the date that they get the notification. And so therefore, if the buyer's out looking for another property and they're sitting in backup position and they find another property, they can terminate that agreement by notifying the seller that they're terminating it. So it's a good idea, I think, in this market. You saw the number of properties that were coming back on the market for let's see where I'm at here. There we go. A lot of sharing going on here. There we go. Okay, so we're back to the end here. Kickout clauses basically are not legitimate in our MLS. Basically, a kickout clause says, I take a contract and continue to market my property. And if another contract comes in, I give the holder of the kickout contract the option of meeting or beating that contract. And then I stay in. If not, the new contract kicks me out. The basic information we got on this from Florida Realtors Legal is that it's misleading to a consumer who would make a full price cash offer, all to find out there was another one in place that they weren't made aware of as the property was active, and then they lost out. So we don't allow them, we don't use them. Some MLSs do. Seller's attorney and buyer's attorney approval gives the seller or buyer the right to say, I want my attorney to look at this for X number of days before it becomes a final. If you're a realtor participant in the property, or if a party, you're working for a related party, like your parents or your brother, or your sister, or your cousin from Peoria, you need to disclose that you have some type of an interest in that property or a relationship to either the buyer or the seller, okay? Binding arbitration is basically saying that both parties agree to binding arbitration. There is mediation and arbitration in the available in the as a dispute resolution in the FAR contract, but the arbitration does not necessarily become binding. It can be, but it isn't unless you have this rider. We are not in Miami-Dade. Seasonal and vacation rentals was added this year for shorter term rentals than regular leases. So these are generally done on reservation agreements, and they require that the seller disclose the terms of these rentals. And I think, as we discussed a little bit on assuming leases, if these are short-term rentals like VRBO or HomeAway, the accounts actually aren't transferred at closing from the seller to the buyer, even though the obligations to lease the property become the obligations of the buyer. The seller may still have an account for those which carry deposits, damage, and the rental proceeds information in them from that rental that was booked when the seller owned the property. So generally, it's a great idea to have an attorney look at all this and draw up something that guarantees the buyer the income, even though the money is still being deposited to the seller's account. And you can't just call up VRBO or HomeAway and say, hey, I want to transfer my seller account to the new buyer. They will not do that. So it can get fairly complicated. So if you're involved in a situation where it's a seasonal vacation rental and they're using the online services, maybe you need to think about having an attorney. They have these agreements drawn up, but they need to tailor them to the specific situation. But you want to make sure your buyer, eventually gets the money. Program assessed clean energy disclosures. There's a statute in the Constitution, Florida Constitution, allowing a buyer and a homeowner to borrow money through a PACE provider for improvements to their home, which include energy savings, hardening your home for storms, things like that. And these are loans that are slightly above prime, but they're available for people that can't get a home equity loan. They were disallowed in Collier County about 2 years ago. There's only about 400 of them in Collier County, but there's quite a few of them in Lee County. And where do I find a PACE disclosure? Where we find the Community Development District disclosure. It's a non-ad valorem line item on the tax bill. So when you look at the tax bill, you see a ad valorem item, it will say PACE. And therefore, you know that there's a loan on the property that actually, by statute, takes higher precedence than the mortgage, and it has to be paid off at closing. The trick is to make sure the way these amounts are posted to the tax bill is a little tricky, so it might be difficult to get a true payoff. So if you have a PACE situation, make sure you get some clarity from the PACE provider as to what the payoff is. Okay, it's 3:06, and we have now covered all aspects of the Fha Va contract. So I know we use a lot of them. We do a lot of our business in Lee County and up on the Cape and Lehigh Acres. So we need to know this contract, and we also have been through the comparison of the Fha Va to the Nabor. So hopefully this is all adding to your repertoire of understanding the contracts. So it's Broker Jeff. Any questions from anybody? Did I put you to sleep? Brian?
No, but thank you, Jeff, very much. Much appreciated, sir.
Hold on a second here. I gotta be able to hear him. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, thank you very much. This has been really, really fabulous.
Well, I appreciate it.
Information's great. Thank you.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much. You all have a great day, and remember to call or text Broker Jeff with any questions you have. Take care now.